He lost his left shoe somewhere outside Princeton. Not in a heroic moment, not in a charge, just a muddy stumble in the dark, weeks earlier during one more retreat that never seemed to end. By Christmas night, Ezra Hart kept his foot wrapped in torn blanket cloth and bound it tight with twine, the way you bind a barrel hoop when the wood's gone stubborn. It worked until it didn't. It kept the blood in his toes, mostly. It kept him moving. That was the whole point now. Keep moving. The Delaware lay in front of him, like a thing that didn't care who won. Black water, ice grinding, wind coming straight off the river and through his coat, as if wool were a rumor. Ezra stood on the Pennsylvania bank with a musket that felt heavier than it had in August. Around him, the army was smaller than it had any right to be. Real quick, if you like what we're doing here, please hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment and let me know what you want to see in upcoming Revolutionary War battles. The men looked like they'd been used hard and put away wet. Some were barefoot. Some had shoes with the soles flapping like loose tongues. Their faces had that hollow set you see on people who haven't slept right in a long time, a week. That's what most of them had left. A week until the year rolled over and their enlistments rolled off. Ezra could picture it too clearly. The first days of January, the snow still on the ground, and whole files of men turning away from the fire, shouldering whatever they could carry and walking home. Not because they were cowards, because they were done, because they'd given what they'd promised, and the country had run out of answers for them. Behind them were months of loss, stacked like cordwood. Long Island, New York, White Plains, Fort Washington, Fort Lee, names that tasted like iron in the mouth. Ezra had been there for enough of it to know the pattern. Fight, fall back, patch the holes, fall back again. The bold talk of summer had drained away. The Declaration had been read in taverns and on courthouse steps, and it had sounded like a future. In December, it sounded like something said too early. He had heard officers speaking in low voices about the commander's letter to his brother, the one where he admitted flat out that the game was nearly up. Ezra didn't need the letter to tell him that. He could see it in the way the men stared at the fire without talking, conserving warmth and hope the same way you conserve flour when the barrel is almost empty. Then came the orders. Quiet, tight, men told to fall in. No drums, no speeches, just movement. Somewhere along the line, Ezra caught a phrase being passed mouth to ear like contraband, the password for the night. Two words that were either ridiculous or perfectly accurate, depending on how honest you were willing to be. Victory or death. Ezra didn't know who chose it. He only knew it fit. In the old world, you might bargain. You might wait out a season. Here, waiting meant dissolving. The boats were already in the water, Durham boats with high sides, flat ferries meant for wagons and livestock, anything that could carry weight. The river was choked with ice, thick slabs drifting and turning in the current. Ezra watched one cake slam into a boat's bow, hard enough to jolt the men aboard. Oars flashed, the boat steadied. The men at the oars weren't farmers. They moved like they belonged on water. Marbleheaders, somebody said. Glover's men, sailors turned soldiers. They spoke in short bursts, not wasting breath, reading the river by feel. Ezra was shoved forward with his file. He stepped down, felt the boat shift under him, and grabbed the gunwale. It was slick. Cold went straight into his palms. He crouched low as they pushed off. The crossing wasn't one dramatic glide. It was labor. It was correction and muscle and swearing under your breath. The wind came hard enough to make the sleet sting like sand. Ice scraped the hull, sometimes softly, sometimes with a crunch that made men flinch. A horse on a nearby ferry screamed, high and panicked, and Ezra heard a man laugh once, one sharp bark of it, then stop as if the sound had embarrassed him. At the far bank, the landing was a churned-up mess of mud and ice, and men hauling on ropes. Ezra clambered out, boots sliding, foot wrapped in cloth already wet through. He looked back and saw cannon coming over. Real cannon, heavy pieces that belonged in fortifications, not in a midnight river crossing. They were being manhandled with a kind of stubborn violence. Henry Knox was there too. Ezra didn't know his name at first, only the shape of him. Big as a bull, a voice that cut through the storm. He was everywhere at once, it seemed, shouting, waving men into place, leaning his weight into a wheel, then bellowing again. Ezra watched an artillery piece tilt, threatened to slide back toward the water, then catch as men heaved and cursed and shoved it onto firmer ground. It took forever. What was supposed to be done by midnight dragged into the dead hours. Ezra could tell by the way the night thinned, by that faint paling in the east that means dawn is coming, whether you're ready or not. Some men muttered that other columns had failed to cross downriver, turned back by the ice. Ezra didn't know what that meant for the plan. He only understood the simple part. If you're late, you lose surprise. If you lose surprise, you die. Still, nobody said go back. Orders came again. The column formed. Ezra took his place, tucked his musket under his arm, and started walking into New Jersey. The march to Trenton was the kind of misery that doesn't feel dramatic while you're living it. It feels small. It feels like a wet sleeve rubbing your wrist raw. It feels like your sock turning into a frozen rag. The nor'easter didn't let up. Snow came hard. Sleet followed. Wind found every gap in a coat. Men leaned into it without thinking, heads down, faces stinging. Their footsteps were muffled by fresh snow, which was the one mercy in the whole business. Ezra's foot began to burn. Then it went numb. Then it burned again. He focused on the back of the man in front of him, the rhythm of moving legs, the only metronome he needed. Every so often, someone would stumble off toward a fence line or a tree, bent double, trying not to vomit. The column swallowed the gap and kept going. At a crossroads called Birmingham, the army split. Ezra stayed with the right-hand column on the river road. Somewhere off to the left, another division moved up the Pennington Road. Ezra could not see them. He could only sense the size of the thing by the way the dark seemed to hold so many bodies. Not long after, the first shots cracked ahead. A Hessian picket, surprised and running. Ezra saw figures in blue scrambling back, shouting, trying to make sense of an attack that had no business appearing in that weather. For weeks, militia raids had harassed those outposts. The Hessians were tired, not drunk, and that mattered. Tired men can still fight. They just fight slower. They make mistakes. They don't think fast enough when the world changes shape in front of them. As gray daylight finally settled over the town, the Americans pushed in. Trenton was not a battlefield in the open. It was streets and houses and fences, corners and sight lines. Ezra moved with his file between buildings, breath coming hard, musket barrel slick. He heard artillery before he saw it, the booming cough of cannon echoing off wood and brick. Then he rounded a corner and saw the guns posted where the streets crossed. King and Queen commanding the town like a fist on a throat. Knox's artillery had made it. That seemed impossible. And yet there it was. Iron mouths pointed down the streets, gunners working fast, coats flapping, rammers flashing in and out like pistons. The Hessians tried to form. They were professionals. They dressed lines. Officers shouted. A regiment pushed forward in an attempted counterattack up King Street, banners whipping in the wind. It had a brief, terrible beauty to it. Men moving into fire because discipline told them to move. Then the American cannon tore into them. Musket fire snapped from windows and doorways. The line wavered, broke and folded back on itself. Ezra fired when he could. He did not aim at faces. He aimed at movement. He saw a man spin and fall. Another man dropped his musket and grabbed at his thigh, as if trying to keep his leg attached. Ezra's world narrowed to loading, priming, firing, and staying upright. Somewhere in the chaos, Colonel Johann Rau was hit. Ezra didn't see the moment. He only heard later that the Hessian commander fell mortally wounded, and that his fall mattered more than any single volley. A unit can survive casualties. It can survive surprise. It has a harder time surviving the sudden absence of the man who was supposed to tell it what the next minute looks like. The fight collapsed fast after that. Hessians fell back toward an orchard outside town, clumping together, trying to regroup, trying to find an exit that wasn't there. The plan had been to trap them completely, with forces crossing at other points. Those crossings hadn't happened, or not enough of them. Even so, the Americans had blocked the crucial roads and seized the rhythm of the streets. The Hessians found themselves penned in by infantry and dominated by guns. One by one, they gave it up. The whole battle lasted less than an hour. That was what people said. Ezra believed it because his body still hadn't warmed up by the time it was over. He stood trembling, looking at hundreds of prisoners under guard, stacked arms piled like cordwood, faces tight with shock and anger and disbelief. The number of captured men felt unreal. The disparity felt like a mistake that would be corrected by some larger force any minute. American losses were shockingly light, only a handful wounded, none killed outright in the fighting. Ezra heard later, quietly, that a couple of men died of exposure during the march. That too felt right. December was taking its own tally. There was no celebration, not the way you'd imagine it. The army was still hungry, still exhausted, still on the wrong side of a river, with British forces nearby that could crush them if they moved fast enough. Ezra watched men strip supplies from captured stores with a kind of grim efficiency: food, blankets, ammunition, things that meant life in the next 48 hours. Prisoners were formed into columns and marched. Then came the withdrawal back to the river. Ezra helped where he could, hauling ropes, steadying wagons, guiding shivering Hessians who looked more surprised than afraid. The sky was leaden, snow still fell. The Delaware waited again, ice still grinding, indifferent as ever. Crossing back felt different, though, not easier, just possible. Ezra's mind had been living in the shape of defeat for so long that victory, even a small one, made the world tilt. The river was still cold, his foot still ached, but the army had done something other than run. Back on the Pennsylvania side, fires were lit. Men hunched close. Ezra unwrapped his foot and saw the skin angry and white, toes swollen, the cloth stiff with frozen water. He rubbed, feeling back into it, until pain returned. Pain meant it was still his. Washington stood on a wagon bed and asked for one more month. Ezra couldn't hear every word over the wind, but he caught enough. Around him, men muttered about home, about warm kitchens, about being done. Ezra looked at his wrapped foot, then at the road behind them, months of retreat that had nearly erased them. He stayed, not for romance, because a cause can be true and still die if nobody stands between it and the cold. It wasn't romance. It wasn't a sudden conversion into myth. It was the memory of that river and those guns and the look on the prisoners' faces when they realized they were beaten by men who had been running for weeks. It was the knowledge that a cause can be true and still die if nobody stands between it and the cold. Ezra didn't think about death in those words, not directly. He thought about the other half of it, the part that meant the revolution might live to see spring. He wrapped his foot again, tighter this time, and went back to the line. Shameless self-pitch. Take a look at my book, An Unfinished Republic. An Unfinished Republic offers a fresh, human-centered lens on the American Revolution, emphasizing the unfinished nature of the Republic as a living, evolving entity shaped by flawed individuals. By framing the revolution not as a tidy triumph, but as a tangled human enterprise, Nolan avoids hagiography and instead delivers nuanced biographies that highlight personal growth contradictions and interpersonal tensions. The blend of biographical sketches, reflective essays, and thematic analysis gives the book a thoughtful, almost philosophical tone, making it more than a standard historical recounting. It's a meditation on American identity. It's available on Amazon and Kindle. The link is in the description.